In this Node.js tutorial, I'm going to show you the right way to use environment variable files in Express using Dotenv, a clean config structure, and some best practices. We'll learn how to set up Dotenv, how to structure our configuration using a config file, how to validate required variables, and where you must import your configuration. Why use environment variables? They let you configure your application from the outside. No hard coding, no code changes across environments. That means we can take our code from local, for example, and put it into production without having to worry about any hard-coded environment variables. If, for example, you hard-code this port, if you hard-coded it here, 5,000 in your code, and it happens to be that in production, the port is supposed to be 4,000. You have a problem because when you take this application and put it into production with hard-coded 5,000 here, it is not going to work. But because we have environment variable configuration that is outside our main code, we can easily take this code, put it into production, and it can read the values from this environment variable files. So the values are outside that can be read from the code. In your environment variable files, you can have whatever makes sense for your application. A common use case includes port, number, node, environment, API key, and stuff like that. I'll go ahead and initialize a new Node.js project. I'm going to say npm init-y. So I'm on my terminal and in a folder called my Express app. Initialize a new project. Because this is part of our Express.js project, I'm going to also install Express and then the package we need for environment variables, and that is .env. Take note that this applies to Node.js project and not necessarily Express project. So I'll say npm install Express and the package we need for environment variables. So .env is the name. Let me create a bunch of files that we are going to need. The first one is gitignore file. So I have a .gitignore here. This is where we tell, even though we are not going to need to push this to a Git repository, but it's a good practice to always ignore your .env file because, for example, if you have a secret there, you don't want to push it to the Git repository. That's why I'm going to have a gitignore file and .env where we're going to have our environment variables. Then to help other developers know what environment variables the project requires, we're going to add a .env.example, but we are not going to gitignore this one because if you don't do this and you gitignore.env and push to the repository, when the next developer clones the project, they can't tell what's supposed to be in .env file. That's why we need this example file. And then we have this config.js where we are going to centralize our configuration variables. Finally, we have server.js. This is going to be the main file for our Node.js application. So I'll hit enter to create those files and I'll head over to VS Code to see the files I've created. Package.json, package log, and node modules. Those are the files generated when we run npm init to initialize new Node.js project. In package.json, I'm going to change index.js to server.js because that is our main file that we created over here. And this is optional, but let me put it, the start command. I'm going to say node server.js. So when we run npm start, it's going to run this node server.js. The next thing I want to do here is to go to gitignore file so I don't forget, and I'm going to add the files to ignore and the one not to ignore. So we are ignoring .env and whatever .env.anything, but we want to keep .env.example. Remember, we are going to commit this to Git and push it. So other developers can see what is required in .env. Another file I want to ignore is node modules, this folder here. Now I'll head over to server.js file and we write very basic Express.js code. Let's have a very basic setup. Import Express, have an object of it, and we're listing on port 4000. You notice one thing here, that we have port 4000 hard coded, and this is not best practice, because what if in production or elsewhere the port shouldn't be 4000? We run into problem. This is one of the things we configure in the environment variables. Talking about the environment variable files, I'm going to add some examples. So I have a port that is set to 4000. Because I'm in my local, I'm setting this to development, that is node environment, and the app name and whatever you want to have in your environment files. Now go to the config.js file and show you what the configuration and validation can look like. So here, the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to explain this later, the console.log. But here I'm requiring that package we install, Dotenv. This is expecting by default that we are going to have a file called .env. You can optionally configure the path for your file, but I'm going to keep it simple. When you import .env and you call the function, the method, whatever, config on it, it expects that you have a file named .env at the root path of your project. So this is .env over here. The next thing I want to do is to make sure that required environment variables are always set in the .env file. For example, the port and app name. So port, this guy here, and app name, I want to make sure that it's always set. Maybe because it is very critical, it's a must-have for the project. And you can validate this however you like. There's no specific way. Basically what I'm doing is to loop over this array of required variables, and for each of them, if it is not set, I'm going to throw an error. This way we make sure that they are set before we run the application, so we don't have issues. And finally, I'm going to export the module. So I'm going to say module.export, and I'm also grouping my environment variable. These are just optional. The way you can configure this however you want. You can just make everything flat if that is what you want, instead of this thing I'm doing here. So there is no fixed way. The point is that I want to have a centralized file for managing the environment variables, but I'm going to leave it like this. It is very important to note that this import here should come early. So you will import and you call .config before you start reading the environment variables. Otherwise, they will be not defined, because this is the guide that helps us to read the file, get the values that are over here. So that's why it has to come early at the top. Now I will go over to server.js and change it. Alright, so in server.js, again I'm requiring Express, and I'm importing the configuration file over here, the config.js file. I want to do this at the top so I can load it early. If I don't do that and I try to access the environment variable, I'm not going to get anything there. For example, over here, I want to check if enable logs is set in environment variable, this guy over here. So how do I do it? I say config, which is the configuration file that I just imported, .features, which is how we just group this thing, right? And enable logs. Enable logs is a boolean here, because I've taken care of checking whether it is set to string true in environment variable. Note that over here, this is not a boolean. This is just a plain text. Whatever you put here is sort of a plain text. So that's why I need to check if enable logs is equal to string true, not a boolean, because this guy doesn't understand booleans. So back in server.js, and if that is enabled, I can go ahead and log the whatever I want to log, like the request URL and HTTP method. And then down here, I'm also making use of the environment variables through the config file. So I'm saying config.app.name and config.app.env. Of course, you can do something like this. So this is the app name. I can come over here in server.js and say process.env.appname. This also works. But the reason for the centralized configuration is you can already see we can do validation, and we can do things like, checking for Boolean use cases, and we have a centralized file that manages our configuration variables. And we can also structure this in a way that makes it easier to understand, like app, features, and whatever. So take note that you can read directly from process.env.whatever as long as you have imported and configured this. Whether you import it in this config file or you go early up here and import it, that also works. But I'm going to leave it here so everything is still centralized in one file. And finally, I'm saying app.listing app config app port. This way we can have like we said before, in the local we can have different environment variables. For example, port is 5000. We have 4000, but it doesn't matter in our local. Port is 5000, is development environment, and this is API secret. In production it can be something else, but the same code is going to work. Alright, to help us better understand this, I'm going to run the application and try to break some configuration. So I'll come over here and say npm start. Remember, we configured that start the script command. Stop that. Then I'm going to do something. Let me take this require.env, and instead of loading it early, I'm going to put it at the bottom here, and we see what happens. I'm going to restart the application. You can see that the validation kicks in. The reason is not because we don't have those variables over here, but because we did not load .env early. We did not load and configure it early, so it's not seeing anything in our .env file. Next thing I'm going to do is, let me return this back, but remove one of the required variables. So for example, I'm going to set nothing for the port. I'm going to clear this and run it again. You can see it says missing required variable port. We know now that our validation truly works. Next, I'm going to initialize git init. Let me clear this and check git status. You can see that we have a bunch of files to commit, but you will notice that .env is not part of it because we git ignored .env. So I'll go ahead and say git add. I'll add everything. Example .env setup. Okay. Let me go ahead and make a change over here. Of course, it's not going to reflect because we don't have that guy. We have that guy git ignored. Let me demonstrate changing the values of environment variables. So for example, let's say in production this is 5000, or for some reason you've changed your port to 5000. We don't need to change anything in the code. We just change the environment variable. I'm going to say node server.js to run the application again. You can see that this time the application is listing in port 5000. Finally, the last thing I want to point out is this console.log here. It's just for you to notice that even if you use this config multiple times in different files, it is loaded only once. This doesn't have to load the configuration each time because it's a module export and it's cached. To demonstrate that, let me start this again. Why does this stop? I think this is supposed to be up and running. I'm not sure why. Okay, I found out why the application runs and stops, because my port 5000 is being used by something else. That is what is causing it. So what I did, let me show you. Basically, I changed this to a different port. For example, port 8000. I can change it to 8001. It doesn't matter as long as it's available. I'm going to start the application again. Now it is listing on port 8001. And back to what we're saying, you'll notice that this loading environment config is called only once here. And even if I visit the URL, let's say the base URL that returns welcome to Express whatever environment, the thing is not logged again, so it gets logged only once. In other words, the .env reads that configuration file, env file, once and it is cached afterwards. So you are free to call it multiple times in different files in your application and not worry about maybe overhead of loading the file, reading this file over and over again. I almost forgot something very important, and that is .env.example. In .env.example, we have all the environment variables that need to be set for this application. So it's basically what we have here in .env, but without the values. So other developers, they will know what to set in their .env. They will create a .env and add the required variables. Okay guys, this brings us to the end of the lesson. I hope it makes sense. Until next time, enjoy coding.